In the quiet town of Tip City, Ohio, the morning of February 16th, 2026, began with a frantic 911 call that would soon send shockwaves through an entire community. A man's voice, trembling and panicked, told the dispatcher that someone had broken into his home. He said his wife had been shot and that there was blood everywhere. The address he gave led officers to a modest house where two young daughters were still asleep down the hallway, unaware that their lives had just changed forever. When police arrived, they found Ashley Flynn in her bed with 2 gunshot wounds to her head. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Standing outside the home was her husband, Caleb Flynn, a man who for years had been known not as a suspect, but as a respected figure in church ministry. Ashley Flynn had spent most of her life rooted in the same Ohio community where she was raised. Friends described her as warm, dependable, and deeply committed to her faith. After graduating from Tippecanoe High School in 2006, she attended a Christian university in Tennessee, where faith, music, and ministry shaped much of student life. It was there that she met Caleb Flynn, a young man from Minnesota who shared similar ambitions. Both were drawn to church leadership and music, and their relationship quickly grew inside a world where faith and purpose were central to everything they believed about their futures. The couple eventually married and began building a life that from the outside seemed devoted to family and church. Caleb pursued ministry as a worship leader, spending years guiding congregations through music and prayer. His role placed him in front of hundreds of people every week, presenting him as a trusted voice within the church community. Ashley supported that life while developing her own connections within the same faith circles, volunteering and investing her time in helping others. Over time, they settled back in Ohio and raised 2 daughters together, creating the image of a stable family grounded in shared belief. For many who knew them, the couple represented the type of marriage often celebrated inside religious communities. Caleb's public identity revolved around devotion, leadership, and faithfulness, while Ashley became known for her kindness and quiet dedication to her family and church. To neighbors and fellow church members, they appeared to be living the kind of life many people hope for, raising children, serving their community, and building a future centered around faith. But beneath that carefully maintained image, investigators would later begin uncovering signs that the life presented to the public might not have matched the private reality inside the Flynn household. Caleb had spent more than a decade working in ministry before eventually stepping away from full-time church leadership and moving into the private business world. The transition meant leaving behind the public role that had defined much of his adult life, a shift that quietly altered the structure of the life he and Ashley had built together. By early 2026, the couple was still living in Tip City with their daughters and remained connected to their church community. Yet something had begun to fracture beneath the surface. Investigators would later allege that Caleb had been involved in a secret relationship that no one around them knew about, a development that added a new and deeply troubling layer to what would soon become a criminal investigation. All of that, however, was still hidden in the early morning darkness when police first arrived at the Flynn home. At that moment, the story appeared to be a terrifying burglary that had turned deadly. A husband claiming an intruder had broken in, a mother killed while sleeping, 2 children still unaware that their mother would never wake up again. Within hours, the quiet neighborhood was filled with flashing lights and investigators trying to piece together what had happened inside that bedroom. What they would eventually discover would raise questions far more disturbing than the possibility of a random break-in. And as the investigation unfolded, attention slowly began shifting away from the unknown intruder described in that desperate phone call and toward the man who had made it. As investigators began documenting the scene and reviewing the initial reports, the details recorded in official filings quickly complicated the story that had been given in the frantic 911 call. Court documents later described a bedroom where Ashley Flynn had been found in bed with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Shell casings from a 9mm handgun were located near the foot of the bed, indicating the shots had been fired at close range. According to police reports, the weapon itself was missing. The absence of the firearm, combined with the claim that an intruder had entered through the garage, immediately placed significant weight on reconstructing exactly how someone could have entered and left the home without being seen. Officers were directed to a side door of the garage that Caleb Flynn had described as the likely point of entry. The door was open when they arrived, but what investigators observed there quickly became one of the most unusual details recorded in the early case file. A large refrigerator was positioned directly against the interior side of the door. According to the responding officer's written report, the appliance would have needed to be pushed aside from inside the garage in order for the door to open. For investigators, that detail created a logistical problem with the burglary narrative. The positioning of the refrigerator suggested that anyone entering from outside would have first needed to move a heavy appliance that was blocking the door from the inside. Inside the bedroom, officers documented the condition of the scene carefully. There were no immediate signs of a prolonged struggle, and the shots appeared precise and deliberate. Ashley Flynn was pronounced dead at the scene shortly after emergency responders arrived. Meanwhile, the couple's 2 daughters remained asleep elsewhere in the house, something investigators also noted when reconstructing the timeline of events. According to the statements Caleb gave officers that night, he had not been sleeping in the same bedroom because of a persistent cough and had been resting in another part of the house when the shooting occurred. As the investigation expanded, detectives began reviewing electronic records and communications connected to the case. Documents referenced in court filings indicated that a text message had allegedly been sent from Caleb's phone at approximately 12:42 a.m., less than 2 hours before the emergency call reporting the shooting. The message, reportedly sent to a woman investigators identified as someone connected to the church community, contained only a brief statement suggesting that something was nearing completion. Prosecutors later pointed to that message as part of the evidence they believed supported the theory that the crime had been planned in advance. 3 days after the shooting, Caleb Flynn was arrested and initially charged with multiple offenses, including murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. As the case progressed, prosecutors presented the evidence to a grand jury in Miami County. On March 18, 2026, the grand jury returned an expanded indictment containing 11 total counts. The charges included 1 count of aggravated murder, 3 additional counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, and 3 counts related to tampering with evidence. The indictment also added 2 misdemeanor counts alleging intimidation of a victim, witness, or attorney connected to the case. The aggravated murder charge carried particular legal significance under Ohio law. Prosecutors argued that the evidence indicated the killing involved what the statute calls prior calculation and design, meaning the act was allegedly planned rather than committed in the heat of the moment. Court filings referenced the physical evidence inside the home, the missing firearm, and the electronic communications that investigators believed were connected to the events of that night. Financial documents also entered the legal record when Ashley Flynn's family sought court protection over the couple's shared assets. Attorneys representing the family cited the existence of a life insurance policy in which Caleb Flynn was listed as the primary beneficiary. They requested access to bank accounts, retirement funds, vehicles, and other property while invoking Ohio's Slayer statute, which prevents a person convicted of killing a beneficiary from receiving financial payouts tied to that death. At his initial court appearance, Caleb Flynn appeared by video from the Miami County Jail. During the brief hearing, the judge reviewed the charges and set bond at $2 million. Caleb told the court he wanted to take care of his daughters and maintained that he was not a risk. But by that point, the legal documents filed in the case were already painting a far more complicated picture of what investigators believed had happened inside that house in the early hours of February 16th. In the days that followed Ashley Flynn's death, news of the case spread rapidly beyond the quiet streets of Tip City. Local outlets were the first to report on the shooting, initially describing it as a possible home invasion that had left a mother of two dead in her own bedroom. Early headlines focused on the shock felt throughout the community. Neighbors spoke about flashing police lights in the early morning hours and the disbelief that something so violent could occur inside a neighborhood known for its calm and familiarity. But as investigators continued gathering evidence, the tone of media coverage began to shift dramatically. Within 3 days of the shooting, reports confirmed that Ashley's husband, Caleb Flynn, had been arrested. The sudden turn in the investigation stunned many people who had followed the early reports of a break-in. News articles quickly began outlining Caleb's background, highlighting his years as a worship leader and his visible role within church communities in both Ohio and South Carolina. Several outlets revisited older interviews and public appearances, including footage from a national singing competition years earlier, where he had spoken warmly about his wife and his faith. The contrast between that public image and the charges now being filed became a central focus of coverage across television and digital media. As journalists began examining the timeline of events leading up to February 16th, new details surfaced through court filings and police statements. Reports referenced the alleged text message sent shortly after midnight, as well as investigators' questions surrounding the garage door that Caleb claimed had been forced open by an intruder. Media outlets also described the physical evidence collected at the scene, including shell casings recovered from the bedroom and the missing handgun that officers believed may have been used in the shooting. While authorities remained careful about revealing too much during an active investigation, the available details were enough to raise growing public skepticism about the original burglary narrative. Coverage also expanded to include the personal story of Ashley Flynn herself. Teachers, students, and community members began sharing memories through interviews and social media posts. Articles described her involvement in church programs and local youth activities, portraying a woman who had spent much of her life serving others. Former students spoke about the encouragement she offered them, while parents described the trust families placed in her as someone who worked closely with children. These reflections gradually shifted the narrative away from the sensational aspects of the crime and toward the life that had been lost. The case drew additional national attention when prosecutors announced the 11-count indictment returned by the grand jury. Major outlets summarized the charges and explained the legal concept of prior calculation and design, emphasizing that investigators believed the killing had been deliberate. News reports also noted the unusually high bond set at $2 million and the additional counts alleging that Caleb had attempted to influence someone connected to the investigation while in jail. Public reaction unfolded across multiple platforms. Online discussions filled with expressions of sympathy for Ashley's family and growing outrage over the allegations. Community members organized gatherings and fundraisers, raising substantial financial support for Ashley's daughters and extended family. At the same time, the church community connected to the case faced its own difficult reckoning. The congregation where Caleb and Ashley had worshipped issued brief statements acknowledging the tragedy, while quietly removing staff listings and limiting public comment as the investigation continued. As the story spread across the country, media outlets increasingly framed the case as a devastating intersection of faith, trust, and alleged betrayal. What began as a report of a violent break-in had evolved into a far more complex narrative, one involving a respected church figure, allegations of deception, and a criminal case that would ultimately be decided in court. For the public watching from afar, the details released through news reports created a timeline that felt both shocking and deeply unsettling. Yet behind every headline and update remained the same central truth. A woman had lost her life, 2 children had lost their mother, and a community was still struggling to understand how such a tragedy could unfold within its own walls. As investigators continued building their case, the emotional dimension of the tragedy began to surface through interviews with people who had known Ashley Flynn personally. Friends, neighbors, and members of the church community struggled to reconcile the allegations with the family they thought they understood. Many described Ashley as someone who was deeply present in the lives of others, the type of person who remembered birthdays, volunteered her time, and offered quiet encouragement to people who needed it most. In conversations with reporters, former students and parents spoke about her patience and warmth, recalling moments where she went out of her way to help children feel confident and supported. Neighbors in Tip City echoed similar memories. Several recalled seeing Ashley outside with her daughters, playing in the yard or spending time together after school. To them, the Flynn household had always appeared like any other family in the neighborhood. Nothing about their daily routines hinted at the kind of violence that would eventually unfold inside the home. That normalcy is what many people later said made the tragedy especially difficult to process. When police vehicles arrived that morning, most assumed something terrible had happened to the family, not that the investigation would soon focus on someone inside it. Members of the church community also spoke cautiously about the case, often emphasizing the shock that followed Caleb Flynn's arrest. For years, he had stood on a stage leading worship services, guiding music that many people associated with their most personal moments of faith. Some congregants admitted they felt confused and even betrayed as the allegations surfaced. Others said they were simply trying to process the situation while focusing their attention on supporting Ashley's family and children. Family friends described Ashley as someone who valued her role as a mother above everything else. Those closest to her said she spoke often about her daughters and the future she hoped they would have. After her death, relatives took on the responsibility of caring for the girls, surrounding them with extended family while the legal process began to unfold. The children themselves remained largely shielded from public attention, but people close to the family acknowledged the painful reality that they would eventually grow up learning about the circumstances surrounding their mother's death. Interviews also revealed how quickly suspicion had developed among investigators that night. Officers who responded to the scene later explained that certain details did not match the typical pattern of a home invasion. While the initial reaction from those present was focused on emergency response, experienced investigators were already examining inconsistencies in the account being given. The unusual placement of objects near the garage door and the absence of clear signs of forced entry prompted immediate questions. Those early doubts would ultimately shape the direction of the investigation in the hours and days that followed. Throughout these conversations, one theme appeared repeatedly. Nearly everyone who had known Ashley described her as someone who made others feel valued and seen. Whether through church activities, youth programs, or simple everyday interactions, she had built relationships that extended across the community. That legacy of kindness became the focus for many people speaking publicly about the case. Even as the legal proceedings moved forward and the details of the investigation continued to emerge, friends and family consistently returned to the same point. They wanted the world to remember who Ashley was, not only the way her life ended. By the time the investigation had advanced into March 2026, the legal focus on Caleb Flynn had intensified. Prosecutors spent weeks reviewing the full body of evidence, everything from forensic reports to digital communications. Every deleted message, every financial transaction, and every discrepancy in Caleb's story was scrutinized for what it could reveal about intent. The grand jury's 11-count indictment reflected not just what had happened in the early hours of February 16th, but the deliberate pattern of alleged planning and deception that preceded it. Prior calculation and design, the legal language used for the aggravated murder charge, became a cornerstone of the case, signaling that the alleged crime was methodical, not impulsive. Attention also turned toward the broader implications of the alleged affair with Aaliyah Botner. While she had not been charged, her role in the narrative was inescapable. Investigators focused on the timeline and the escalating communication between her and Caleb in the days leading up to Ashley's death. Court documents allegedly leaked indicated that the relationship intensified significantly, culminating in the text sent at 12:42 a.m. on February 16th, reading, "It's almost done." That text, prosecutors argued, demonstrated foresight, a premeditated step in a sequence of actions designed to eliminate an obstacle, Ashley, while preserving Caleb's reputation and his hold on the community. Meanwhile, the media attention surrounding the case began to amplify. Footage from body cams, interviews with neighbors, and images of the crime scene were disseminated widely, painting a vivid picture of the morning of the shooting. Analysts noted the chilling juxtaposition. A man who had spent over a decade as a public spiritual leader, performing devotion and love in front of congregations, now at the center of an investigation into the murder of his own wife. Public reaction ranged from shock to disbelief, particularly among those who had followed Caleb's years on the worship stage. Social media discussions oscillated between grief for Ashley and outrage toward Caleb, while debates over motive and morality surged across news platforms. Financial and legal maneuvers became another critical element of the case. The Flynn family's assets and life insurance policies were immediately frozen under Ohio's Slayer statute, ensuring that no potential benefit could be claimed by someone accused of killing the insured. Attorneys for Ashley's family aggressively pursued control over joint accounts and other shared financial resources, aiming to safeguard the daughter's future. This step was seen as both necessary and symbolic, a means of preventing any alleged advantage from the crime from impacting Ashley's children. Finally, the emotional narrative remained central. Public memorials, private gatherings, and moments of remembrance highlighted the deep impact Ashley had on her community. Fundraisers and tributes emphasized the enduring influence of her life as friends and family tried to provide stability and support for her young daughters. Amid the legal complexities and the shocking allegations, one constant remained clear. Ashley Flynn's presence and her legacy were being honored by everyone who knew her. The community's response underscored that while the alleged crime had ended her life, it had not erased the positive mark she left behind, a mark that would continue to guide and inspire her children, family, and countless others. This phase of the investigation set the stage for the next crucial chapter, the trial. The evidence gathered, the narrative reconstructed, and the community's awareness of both the alleged crime and the lives it touched ensured that when the courtroom doors finally opened, the stakes would be higher than ever. It was no longer just a case about what happened on Cunningham Court. It was a story about identity, betrayal, calculation, and the ripple effects of a life lost too soon. By early spring 2026, the case against Caleb Flynn had reached a point where the courtroom would soon become the epicenter of a community's reckoning. Preparations for the preliminary hearing on March 26th were underway, with prosecutors assembling every piece of evidence and every witness testimony that could demonstrate premeditation. Investigators and attorneys meticulously reviewed the timeline of events, emphasizing the 12:42 a.m. text and the sequence of actions that allegedly led to Ashley's death. They sought to show that the murder was not an isolated incident of passion or anger. It was, according to the indictment, a calculated act executed to preserve a lifestyle, reputation, and sense of control. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, began laying the groundwork to challenge the prosecution's narrative. They questioned whether circumstantial evidence, deleted messages, financial records, and physical layout of the home could conclusively prove intent. They argued that Caleb Flynn's grief, visible in the body cam footage, and his behavior at Ashley's parents' home might indicate shock and loss rather than malice. The tension between the public performance of mourning and the private actions alleged by investigators became a central theme in pretrial discussions, highlighting the complexity of a case that blended legal, emotional, and moral considerations. Outside the courtroom, the community continued to respond to the tragedy with a mixture of sorrow and vigilance. Memorials for Ashley Flynn remained active, emphasizing her impact on her students, volleyball teams, and church community. Fundraisers ensured her daughters were supported, while local congregations and neighbors tried to reconcile the reality of Caleb's alleged actions with the image of a man who had spent over a decade leading worship and teaching faith. The duality of Caleb's life, the public, devout husband, and the alleged private conspirator, remained a source of intense discussion and scrutiny. Investigators also began to analyze the broader patterns of behavior associated with crimes like this. Prior cases, including those in Texas and elsewhere, provided context for understanding how a person's identity, standing in a faith community, and fear of public collapse could factor into violent decisions. Prosecutors and criminologists emphasize that premeditation often emerges not from sudden rage, but from a careful calculation aimed at managing perception and consequence. The goal, according to experts, is control. Control over narrative, control over community reaction, and control over one's own status. As March 26th approached, the preliminary hearing promised to provide the first public, detailed examination of the evidence. While no trial had yet been scheduled, the hearing was expected to clarify whether the charges against Caleb Flynn would proceed to full trial. It was also an opportunity for the community, the media, and the family to confront the complexities of a case that blurred the lines between faith, identity, and criminal intent. Every witness, document, and forensic analysis presented would add another layer to an already intricate story. A story that demanded careful attention both to the legal proceedings and to the life of the woman at its center, Ashley Flynn. Ultimately, Section 6 closes with the realization that this case is far from over. The trial would not just determine the fate of Caleb Flynn, it would also challenge the community's understanding of trust, devotion, and the human capacity for deception. And through it all, the daughters of Ashley Flynn remain the silent center of the unfolding tragedy, their lives indelibly marked by a sequence of events that began on Cunningham Court in the early hours of February 16th. The world watches, waiting for justice, and for the full story to finally be told in the courtroom where truth and consequence will collide.